A mobster used the N-word on Bumpy Johnson. His 6-word response made the Mafia never return. The words hit the room like a fist before anyone moved. A single insult, sharp, deliberate. Silence froze the air. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. Yet every eye knew the streets were about to answer. The room smelled of whiskey, cigarette smoke, and polished wood. Jazz scratched faintly from a corner speaker, but even music bowed to the tension. Bumpy Johnson leaned against the bar, hands resting lightly, eyes scanning, not searching, just seeing. The night had a rhythm, and he moved with it, calm, deliberate. Then it came, the words, sharp, cruel, spoken by a man who thought he owned the air, who thought a lifetime of threats could touch someone like Bumpy. The N-word, a blade hidden in syllables. The laughter that followed tried to fill the space, to convince the room that the insult was nothing. But everyone knew better. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a candle left too long, twisting and curling in every corner of the room. Every man, every woman, every bartender and busboy felt it. Even the shadows seemed to pause, leaning in to watch what would come next. He let the silence stretch, thick and deliberate. Harlem had taught him that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And when it speaks, it cannot be ignored. The offending man leaned back, chest rising with arrogance, unaware that the room had shifted, that every glance, every subtle movement was now measured against Bumpy's presence. Bumpy took a single breath. He adjusted the brim of his hat, eyes scanning, calm, slow, purposeful. The room exhaled without knowing it, every heartbeat sinking to the certainty that something had changed. And in that quiet, in that controlled, heavy pause, the streets outside began to murmur. Respect, once challenged, would be restored. But not yet, not in words, not in violence. Bumpy stepped onto the street like he owned every inch of it, though he didn't need to claim it aloud. The night was humid, the lamps casting halos over cracked sidewalks, and every corner whispered the city's memory. Harlem had a language of its own, a pulse, a rhythm, a network of eyes and ears that spoke louder than guns. And tonight it spoke of him. Shopkeepers paused mid-sweep. Old men leaning on crates stopped shifting their weight. Children playing stickball on the corner froze in their game. Bats suspended mid-swing. Even the streetcars hummed softer, as if the city itself sensed the shift. Bumpy didn't rush. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, each one a note in the unspoken symphony of authority. He passed the corner where rumors traveled faster than light, eyes scanning. A young man tried to step out, maybe to challenge the quiet weight in his stride. Bumpy glanced once, slow, calm, unblinking. The man stopped, stuttered, turned back, muttering apologies to the wind. No words were necessary. The lesson had already landed. Harlem listened. He reached the newsstand and paused, watching the city breathe around him. Names in the paper meant nothing. Headlines carried no weight. What mattered were patterns. Who nodded, who averted their gaze, who whispered under their breath. Loyalty, respect, and fear. These were the currencies that mattered here, and Bumpy held them all. A group of men smoked on the stoop across the street, thinking they could hide in numbers. They didn't know patience had teeth. The calm in Bumpy's eyes, the stillness in his stance, spoke louder than any threat. In a world that often rewarded noise, Bumpy had mastered silence. And silence, tonight, was sharper than any gun. The wind shifted, carrying snippets of conversation, laughs that faltered midward. Harlem's memory stretched like a shadow across brick and asphalt. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew the insult. And everyone understood that the man who had been disrespected was not just waiting. He was preparing, calculating, and the city itself was his witness. By the time he reached the end of the block, the pattern was clear. The 6 men who had thought themselves untouchable now walked in a web they hadn't even felt. Every step they took echoed in the rhythm Bumpy set. He didn't need to strike. The streets had already spoken. Harlem watched, and in watching, it remembered. Respect wasn't demanded, It was recognized. And tonight, Bumpy Johnson reminded every soul in the neighborhood who measured it most accurately. The six men walked through Harlem like kings of a kingdom that no longer existed. Laughter hung heavy around them, sharp and careless, smoke curling from their cigarettes into the humid night. They didn't notice the shift in the air, the subtle narrowing of the streets, the way shadows seemed to lengthen at just the right angle. Bumpy observed from the corner, hands tucked into his coat pockets, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Not a step too fast, not a word. Calmness was his weapon, patience his strategy. Each man had a pattern, a rhythm he relied upon, and Bumpy had memorized them all. Where they stopped for liquor, what stoop they lingered at, the way one twirled a lighter before lighting his cigarette. Every detail mattered. They moved with arrogance, thinking the city shielded them. They didn't hear the soft whispers behind closed doors, the murmurs that carried warnings from one corner to the next. A woman leaning out of her window saw them, saw him, and whispered to the neighbor beside her. Eyes shifted, heads turned subtly. The net was closing without noise, without spectacle. Bumpy's presence was a quiet weight in the city's memory. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, but the men felt it, even if they didn't recognize it yet. Unease flickered in glances exchanged, a pause in their laughter, a hesitation in movement. Still, they pressed on, blinded by arrogance, thinking restraint was indecision. That was their mistake. He walked through the block, a ghost among brick and asphalt, touching the brim of his hat as if adjusting time itself. Each motion deliberate, each breath a measured reminder that patience in the wrong hands is chaos, in his inevitability. Every eye that met his, every subtle nod or recoil, reinforced the unspoken truth. The city watched, and Bumpy's patience was not weakness. By midnight, they had unknowingly walked into the web of his making. Every action, every habit had been observed, every step accounted for. And when the time came, there would be no escape. Not because he was faster, but because he had already dictated the terms. Calm had become a weapon sharper than any knife. Silence had become the sentence. The six men didn't see it yet. They thought the night belonged to them. But the city remembered, and so did he. And Harlem, in its quiet omniscience, began whispering. Tonight, the balance had begun to shift. It happened where the city always watched. A street corner, narrow and sunless, where merchants shouted prices and children darted between shadows, where deals were whispered over crates and iron gates. The six men lingered, careless, their laughter cutting through the morning air like broken glass. They didn't see him at first, not yet, but the city did. Bumpy arrived quietly, his coat buttoned, his hands resting easily at his sides. He didn't need a rush. The air thickened around him as if the street itself had grown heavier, waiting for him to decide the moment's weight. Shopkeepers paused mid-task. A paperboy froze with a bundle under his arm. Windows cracked open as though the walls themselves wanted a glimpse. Everyone sensed the shift, even before he stepped fully into view. The six men didn't notice the change in gravity. They thought mockery was harmless. They taunted his name, sneered about him in the open, thinking silence would protect them. But silence had no shields here, only the memory of respect long earned. And respect, when tested, has teeth. Bumpy let the laughter hang in the air. He didn't speak. He didn't move too quickly. His eyes swept over them slowly, deliberate, weighing, measuring. One man stepped forward, a slight smirk still curling on his face. That was the mistake. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, and time seemed to bend. The man froze, mid-step, the smirk faltering as the air tightened around him. Every passerby felt it. The way authority doesn't announce itself with noise, but with presence. The corner boys on crates stopped laughing. The barbers paused mid-snip. Even the air seemed to hesitate. A single glance from Bumpy, and the six realized that the line had been crossed, and the city was watching. This wasn't chaos. There were no fists raised yet, no cries of rage. The power was in restraint, in the measured silence that allowed consequence to breathe before striking. Each man could feel it, The weight of past disrespect, the collective memory of every slight, every insult they had thrown across Harlem, now pressing down on them at once. Bumpy took a step forward, slow, deliberate. The street didn't shrink. He did not need it to, but it seemed smaller, constricted by inevitability. The city leaned in with him. Windows, doorways, corners, all witnesses to a lesson that required no words. The laughter had died, replaced by tension that rolled down the block like an approaching tide. One by one, the six understood the principle that governed this street. Respect wasn't optional. It wasn't something to be demanded or argued for. It existed in quiet authority, in control, in the patience that carried the promise of consequence. And in that moment, Bumpy reminded Harlem that disrespect carried a price, measured, deliberate, unavoidable. The lesson was clear. Not for the city, not for the six men, not even for Bumpy himself. It was for everyone. Power, when exercised with restraint, becomes permanent. Silence, when filled with authority, becomes louder than any shout. And in the streets of Harlem, respect had been reaffirmed. Bumpy didn't hurry. Not a step faster than necessary. Not a curse, not a shout, not even a glance that could betray impatience. The street had cleared, naturally, as though the city itself knew to give space. Silence stretched between him and the six men, taut, a wire pulled tight across the block. Each of them could feel it now, the inevitability of what was coming. The calm wasn't weakness. It was precision. Every measured footstep he took carried authority, every small shift of his weight calculated. Control wasn't announced, it was recognized. The street, the walls, the crowd of silent witnesses, they all acknowledged it. Bumpy stopped a deliberate distance away, letting the space do the work for him. The men glanced at one another, unease creeping into their features. Smirks faded. Laughter vanished. Here, restraint was sharper than steel. It cut slower but deeper. He did not speak. He did not explain. Words were unnecessary. His hands moved with quiet inevitability, checking chains, ropes, arranging positions. Each motion was deliberate, each adjustment precise. The six men, once confident, now understood that hesitation had been an illusion. They were aligned, physically and morally, by a choice that Bumpy had already decided in silence. The lesson was total. Power lives in control, not fury. One man tried to shift, a last attempt at defiance, but Bumpy's eyes met his. No words, no anger, just inevitability. The man froze, understanding that resistance here was futile. It wasn't fear of violence, it was certainty. In Bumpy's calm, there was law. In his quiet, there was consequence. The city watched, still and reverent. Windows framed onlookers, doorways held silent witnesses. Even the pigeons that scattered at the first sign of human movement hesitated. This wasn't spectacle, it was authority incarnate. The six men had learned in every glance, every step, every pause. Respect was earned, and it could not be cheated. By the time Bumpy finished, alignment was complete. The act itself wasn't loud. There were no screams, no chaos, only the weight of inevitability carried in every inch of his posture, every calm breath he took. The street felt permanent, frozen in understanding. Lessons like this lingered. They became part of the city, part of the neighborhood, part of the legacy Bumpy had been building for decades. And when the final adjustment was made, the moment had already passed. Yet the authority remained unbroken, unspoken, unforgettable. Harlem knew it. The six men knew it. Everyone who had watched understood the quietest truth of all. Power, exercised with control, was absolute. The street was quiet after Bumpy left. Not a cheer, not a murmur, just a stillness that felt alive. It wasn't emptiness. It was acknowledgement. Harlem had witnessed a measure of power that didn't need noise, and the weight of that understanding settled into every cracked sidewalk, every fire escape, every doorway. People moved differently now. Children paused mid-laugh, sensing the gravity in the air. Shopkeepers leaned against counters a little straighter, eyes scanning the street more carefully. Even the old men on crates, their hands gnarled from years, tipped their fedoras, not in fear, but in recognition. Respect had been observed, lessons had been delivered, and community had absorbed them. The 6 men, aligned, controlled, subdued, were no longer just individuals. They were part of a story that would ripple through Harlem for months, perhaps years. Their names would be whispered, not in defiance, but in understanding. Bumpy had shown that consequence did not require spectacle, only certainty. And certainty had a voice louder than guns, sharper than knives. Bumpy walked away without looking back. He didn't need confirmation. The city had spoken on his behalf. The streets remembered, and memory was more powerful than any momentary victory. Loyalty, order, and principle had been reinforced without a shout, without a struggle. That was the weight he carried, and the gift he left to Harlem. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the neighborhood subtly shifted. Eyes watched more closely, heads nodded with quiet understanding, and even those who had never seen Bumpy in action felt the echoes of his authority. He had not sought fear, he had demanded recognition. The lesson was clear. Respect could not be stolen, insult could not be ignored, and betrayal carried its own reckoning. Harlem remembered not the violence itself, but the calm that preceded it. Every choice Bumpy made, measured and deliberate, became part of the city's collective memory. His legacy wasn't built in fury. It was built in control, principle, and inevitability. And in that quiet aftermath, it was absolute.